Okay then. Hello. Welcome back. Hope you're feeling a bit re-energized after maybe not that much. Okay. I hope you're feeling re-energized after your lunch break and perhaps seeing some daylight, which I've personally really enjoyed. So for our first slot after lunch, in which your challenge is to stay awake if you just ate sponge and custard like I did, is Michael. What can I say about Michael? Well, there's a lot of things I could say, but the things I think you want to hear are Michael's a PHP fanatic. And more than that, he's a PHP community fanatic. He's active both as a community person but also as a code contributor in a bunch of different settings, and has kind of worked up through that over the years. Something that I personally really respect. His topic today, talking about feature flags, covers something which I think we'll be doing as standard if we're not doing it already. There's a few different approaches, and it's something which can be added to your existing application and make a really big difference. So I felt that this topic is really relevant to all of us and well worth staying awake for in the post-lunch dip. Michael, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So as Lorna was can you all hear me, by the way, just at the back? Yeah, cool, fab. So it's a talk on flipping out with feature flags and toggles. Feature flags and toggles are the same thing. I just wanted to make the title a bit longer, so why not? Very quickly, the unimportant bit of the talk. Who am I? My name is Michael Cullum. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to tweet abuse at me. Feel free to tweet constructive feedback. I'm completely defenseless up here. The last time in a talk I actually said to tweet me during my talk, they started tweeting me and I had TweetDeck open in Google Chrome, and it was connected via HDMI and I couldn't disable the sound. So I then had to ask everyone to stop tweeting. So could someone tweet at me now and just make sure that's not an issue before we get going? I work for a great company called Sam Knows. I've started working for them at the beginning of this year. We do awesome stuff with data, internet measurements, making your internet faster, basically, which is not a bad thing, right? Lorna mentioned I work on a few open source projects. PHP BB, I've been involved with PHP BB for probably like 7, 8 years now. Way too long. I'm on the management team of that, if you want to come chat to me about that. We're a lot less buggy and hacked than we used to be. And I also am a secretary of the PHP Fig. Who's heard of the Fig? Most of you, cool. So the PHP Fig is a group of different open source projects coming together to form, work towards interoperability and common goals and collaboration on a variety of different subjects. But yeah, you don't care who I am, you just want to hear about feature flags, right? So I want to talk about some basics. Feature flags, this is a conditional if statement. Who has used a conditional if statement in the past couple of weeks at work? Most of you. Who hasn't? Okay. Raf, I'm slightly concerned. That's basically a feature flag. Feature flags are basically just about doing one thing if you have one thing enabled, and another thing if you don't. Obviously, if it's always true, then we know what the result is always going to be. But if we put a variable in there, if this feature is enabled, that's just a standard variable, right? This is a feature flag. Who has code that looks like this in their applications? Everyone. So you're all using feature flags. OK, I'll just go home. Sorry, Lorna. But we can make this a little bit more complex. I've just got this function called feature enabled because, why bother with OOP? But if we want to say Twitter seen, was it seen on Twitter? We can do one thing, if not do another. And this is where the power of feature flags really comes from. So what's in a name? Why is a feature flag not just a conditional if statement? Why am I doing a talk on if statements? SwiftMailer. So who's used SwiftMailer in the room? Quite a few of you. Who's used it in the context of Symfony? OK, so I use Symfony quite a lot. A lot of the examples I'll use are sort of Symfony related. That's more just to sort of give you an idea of how you can do it in one framework and one architecture. All of this is applicable to to other frameworks or other ways you happen to glue your applications together. So who has, in Symfony or something else, used this option called Disable Delivery in SwiftMailer? A few of you. So for those of you who have used SwiftMailer, haven't used this option, it's a really great option you can use for testing or development. It essentially just disables delivery of emails. It still goes through the process. It errors silently. So, of course, when you accidentally deploy it to production, you have no idea what's going on. However, it is actually a really useful feature when you're working locally. And this is a feature flag. So all of you that just put your hands up, you've used a feature flag. This is how it actually works if you then dig into the core. It says if it is set, the mailer disable delivery, then we just simply set the transport to null. That's that is the important part that feature flag does. You set it in a configuration file, a YAML file, an XML file, however you choose to do your configuration. Really, it's up to you, right? And then we also have, Symfony does other things, setting parameters, just so that you can access that from a more global way, just if you want to be able to see what's going on. But that's a feature flag, and that goes through an application in a much more complex way. That goes through from Symfony configuration, into a parameter, into the container, and then eventually it filters through into this little bit of code here, and then we just change what the transport is. So that's kind of what a feature flag is. What can you use it for? An alternative to branching, who uses Git? Who doesn't use Git? Who doesn't use branches in Git? Okay, nobody. Fantastic. Monolithic repositories, particularly if you work at somewhere like Google or Flickr, they just work in one big monolithic repository. They don't have branches. They don't need branches. They all just commit to one big repository. If I'm some random guy working on Google, I imagine that I can probably end up committing to core search. I'm not quite sure how that works in the end. But they just all commit straight to the code. And the way that they do that is with feature flags. So instead of having 50 different branches with 50 different features, they commit all of these features to core, and they just simply have them disabled. And that's a great way to avoid conflicts. Who likes Git conflicts? Lorna, you like Git conflicts? Okay, fair enough. Anyone else like Git conflicts? Okay, nobody. Good. Sorry, Lorna. Git conflicts are an absolute nightmare, but realistically, with feature flags, you never really have that because you're never merging two branches together. You never have these weird matrix of changes coming together. You're always just committing straight up. It allows you to vary by two different things. So you can vary your features by both your environment and your user. So you could have a feature enabled in staging or in your personal development and not in production, which is exactly what we kind of do with branches, right? We have this code that only exists on our particular development branch in our checked out version that's not in production. In the same way, when you have staging, then you have code that exists in staging but doesn't exist in production. Now, in an application, essentially, when you have an if statement, it's almost like that code doesn't exist if it's never going to get to that point in the tree. So feature flags are just a way of not having to deal with branches, and you can get that straight up there. You can also vary by user. And this is where the real power of feature flags kind of comes in, and I'll talk a lot more about this as we go on through the talk. But essentially, you can either say, hi, I want to, this is where the logic gets a lot more complex. You can say, I want to give certain roles access to this feature. For example, you might want to give certain roles access to a delete user feature. Now, then you're actually looking at feature flags as not just something that you're enabling as you're actually using it to sort of almost as authentication. So again, we're going back to that very close relationship between any type of conditional and a feature flag, right? And then going further, you can do things like A/B testing and stuff like that, which I'm going to talk about now. So different subset of users. Who has ever gone on Facebook and not seen a feature that one of their American friends has mentioned or something like that? Or, yeah, so a few of you have heard it. Facebook do this a lot, and it annoys a lot of people. Essentially, what they'll do is they'll deploy one feature to the United States, for example, their graph search, which was quite famous for this number of years ago. You could sort of look at specific relationships, or you could see which friends were that grew up in this place just from the search bar. But they only released this in the United States, and maybe a couple of other countries. They didn't release it in the UK. If you were a UK user, you just didn't get it. In the same way, there are similar apps, just like Swarm. Has anyone used Swarm? A few of you again. Swarm is an app where you can check into places, and whenever I go to the United States, I have features where it will give me adverts. I'll get challenges to go and I was there on election day last year, and it was there was a challenge to go and visit a polling booth or something like that, and then you get a few hundred coins or something. So, but that doesn't exist in the UK. That's a feature flag, essentially, delivering it to a different subset of users. Now, one common way to deliver something to a subset of users is not just, in a stage rollout because, you haven't got approval in one country or whatever, or you haven't got advertising partners in the United States, in the United Kingdom, but you do in the United States. But for A/B testing. Now, who does A/B testing? Okay, who does A/B testing on back-end stuff as well as front-end stuff? Only a couple of you. So A/B testing is a lot more commonly seen in front-end. In the front end, it's generally, you generally see it to do with things like conversion rates. So you'll see someone testing two different features, and if they convert more people, then that's great. If they don't, then it's a great way to be able to get some metric data as to what features work well. And feature flags are actually a really great way of doing this. I was having a discussion last night with Noxie and Raphael, and I actually added in this slide after speaking with them. And I'm just going to call it the booking.com model because I'm currently doing a talk, which means I can invent names of models. That's how this works, right? So booking.com. Does anyone know what booking.com does? Yeah. So essentially, they have one type of conversion, which is you make a booking. That's all they really care about. Have you made a booking or have you not made a booking? They're also a really huge site, which means that they have, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would assume hundreds of thousands of, visitors, millions of visitors, whatever. What they do is they do A, B, C through to Z testing, which basically means that no matter who you are, if you visit the homepage, then you'll probably get a different homepage than someone else. If Lorna goes and has a look at Booking.com on her laptop and I look at it on mine, we'll get completely different results. And that's not to say we've got cookies or we've just visited the site before or anything like that. That's just because we're experiencing Booking.com's A/B testing. And what they do is it's extreme continuous deployment. So they'll make a feature or whatever. A developer will just suddenly just make this and just throw it out there. They won't do any automated testing on it. They won't have a QA process or anything like that. And that will get thrown into the pool of different feature matrices that they have. And it might go to like 10 users or whatever. I'm not speaking specifically to Booking.com. I don't know the exact details. I'm more talking about the model here. Might go to 10 users. And if they notice an exception come through, then they'll just take that out of the pool. And that feature flag then will be disabled, essentially. However, if that feature flag actually results in a higher than usual conversion rate, then they'll give that to more users. So then instead of just being accessible by 10 users, they'll give it to 100. And then they'll see, is the conversion rate continuing to go up, or has the conversion rate dropped from what it was previously to the exact same state but without that one feature? And then they have this automated deployment where it just goes to more and more users. They don't need a product manager to say, I really like this feature, I approve of this feature, we should deploy this to the entire site. They just simply have a system where it automatically gets scaled up, and suddenly everyone on Booking.com has a feature that says, hey, there are only 3 different beds left at this particular hotel. And what that means is that you don't have to have all of these processes for deciding what features are. It's very, very data-driven. I've just started working at a data company, and as developers, we feel like we know a lot about data, but data is so much more useful than anyone can imagine. And this is extreme continuous deployment. It's extreme data-driven development, and it's extreme use of feature flags because every single feature on there is a feature flag, and then eventually it'll end up being used by everyone. Now, that's kind of an example of this, which is testing in production. Who tests in production? Okay, so everyone who didn't raise their hands, are you telling me that you deploy features and then don't test them once they're in production? You just say, oh, I hope it works because it worked on staging. You don't go and manually check that change probably worked. I think everyone in this room, realistically, probably actually does test in production. You deploy something and then you see if it worked afterwards, right? Otherwise, it could have been broken and you wouldn't know why or whatever. Testing in production is not a bad thing to do. Testing in production is actually a really important thing to do. No matter how good your automated test suite is, sometimes it misses things. Sometimes your environment is slightly messed up and you've made a mistake and that's something you can go back and fix. But testing in production is really important, and realistically it's something we should all do. But this allows us to take testing in production to the next step. Booking.com, the Booking.com model, they don't care if they get 2 users that get thrown an exception, and they'll just take that out of the pool. Because realistically, they haven't actually really lost much money. However, they're just taking that's an extreme version of testing in production. But what GitHub do, for example, is they'll deploy a feature. They'll deploy it to certain members of staff. And then suddenly, they're essentially just testing that in a production environment, just because they have the feature enabled for people with that specific role. In the same way, Facebook, they'll deploy it to a certain number of people, and then they'll see, yes, this works fine for people in the United States, let's deploy it and do a global deployment. Does anyone else do staged deployments in terms of deploying to different countries or different servers, etc.? Yeah, a few of you. So essentially, that's what you're doing. You're doing testing in production, right? Monolithic repositories, I've kind of talked a little bit about this already. If you want to have all of your different changes putting together, it saves you on Git conflicts. And realistically, everyone working on the same bit of code is not actually a bad thing. Who has pull requests sometimes, and you've got 3 or 4 people working on the same thing, and then you've got one feature that actually depends on this feature, so then they create a pull request, and that pull request uses the code in this branch, and then they start reviewing that pull request, and they review the other person's code, and then you've got another feature which depends on that feature, and then you've got all of these different matrix of changes, and then you start merging stuff. And then suddenly your test suite starts failing, right? You don't know whether or not these changes actually work together. You've got this horrible mess with pull requests. Monolithic repositories kind of solve that. Testing a matrix of changes. Who uses Travis? Who uses Travis to test on different PHP versions or different MySQL versions or something like that? So essentially what you're doing there is you're testing on a different matrix of environments, which for open source projects is really important and quite useful to do. For enterprise projects or stuff you're doing at work, it's not necessarily as useful potentially because you should always be deploying to one environment. However, it's kind of useful in terms of if you're planning on deploying to the next PHP version to have, say, PHP 7 on there if you're running PHP 7, and then having 7.1 and nightly on there. So then when you're developing stuff for the future, you know it's not breaking. But testing a matrix of changes with feature flags is really easy. I can enable whichever feature flags I want, both in development, and I can see how these features interact together. I can see how this new profile page interacts with the new profile pictures infrastructure that we're building. And you can use that both in your automated tests and locally when you're manually looking at how things are working or running your local test suite. So I've talked about all these wonderful flags. I've said how wonderful they are. You've all been converted. You all want to use them. You're all going to go home on Monday and start using feature flags. But first of all, I want to say, hang on a sec. You need to know how to manage your feature flags. There's a committee that can help with this if you live in the UK. But personally, I don't know anyone on that committee, and so they're not really going to be able to help me. So retrieving these feature flags, how can we, and as I said, this is going to be a slightly Symfony-orientated thing, but just try and strip the framework logic out. Retrieving feature flag values, how to actually see if a feature flag is enabled. Starts off, kind of simple, an interface. We all like interfaces, right? Interfaces are great. And it's the most simple interface imaginable, really. You have one method on it, is enabled, yeah. Is enabled. You've got a string which is your key. So that might be new profile page or the Twitter share functionality or showing number of rooms available left at booking.com, whatever. You're returning a Boolean, yes or no. Is the feature flag enabled? Is it not? Then we build implementations for this. So function is enabled string flag, and this is the most basic implementation. This is just a function where essentially we've got an if statement. We're hard coding in what that feature flag is. In this case, it happens to be profile. And if the flag is profile, then we return true. This is the most simple way if you want that very quick return on feature flags on how you can do it. But this very quickly gets out of control. When you suddenly have 200 feature flags, you have this 300, 400 line PHP file with essentially this huge if statement or switch or whatever in it. The one thing I will note here is this return false, though. And this is essential, because realistically, the default for a feature flag should always be to return false. The feature flag should always be, if the feature flag doesn't exist, then it probably means that it hasn't been defined and therefore you don't want it enabled. A feature flag should always be for new stuff. It should never be, it should fail safe, essentially. You don't want to accidentally deploy something and then find out the record, you don't have a row in the DB with that particular key, for example, and then suddenly you're showing everyone in the world your brand new profile page that hasn't even been tested with automated tests or by your QA team. That's bad, by the way. And this is really easy to use. Just if is enabled profile, do your new profile magic, right? Obviously, I'm just kind of excluding OOT, but for sake of argument. This can get more complicated, though. So if we go back to our whole Swift mailer example, what this specifically does is we've just got this hard-coded thing in here saying if the flag happens to be mail delivery, then we're going to call this very specific parameter from the Symfony container. Can you read this at the back? Yeah, cool. If the flag is mail delivery, then we're going to get the Swift mailer enabled flag from the container. If it's not, then we're actually just going to dynamically get this from the container. So I'm just doing some sprintf here. And I'm saying flag dot, and then whatever the flag name is. And then I don't have to touch my PHP code at all to add a feature flag. All I need to do is actually just add a configuration option to my config.yaml or XML or whatever. And then I can use it in my code, and that's fine. And if I forget to add it to my configuration files, then that's still fine, because we're still returning false. The default should always be false. Especially in instances like this where you're fetching it dynamically, it might not exist, it might not find it. It's really important to be able to return false here. You can do something more complicated, particularly if you start going towards a database and you can start looking in cache. You could say, hi, this is a PSR6 cache. I want to get the item from the cache, and again, using that dynamic flag naming. So as long as it exists in the cache, I don't have to define this in any PHP files. All I have to know is the flag name that's a string that's being passed into this method, and then I send it straight off to wherever all my feature flags are being stored. If it's a hit, then I can get it. If it's not, then obviously I can then do wherever I store my feature flags, whether that's configuration or databases. Databases are a great way to store feature flags. If you want to be able to do anything more powerful with it. So, for example, if you have different config.yaml files, then realistically you're constrained by environment there. You can't really do anything more complicated than a true or false or whatever. You have to handle making sure that you've got the right config.yaml file in certain environments. If locally you decide that actually you want to suddenly start integrating this enable this other feature so you can see how they work together, you've got to start editing configuration files. And then, of course, when you do git add and then a full stop, press enter and you accidentally commit your development stuff. Who's committed var dump before? Yeah, exactly. Who's committed var dump to production? Okay. Fair enough. Again, feature flags, you have to be really careful that they don't make it through to production, especially when it's just development features. So you can get in, this is a very simple flag value, 1 or a 0, tiny int boolean on these different flags. I'd suggest having a set of fixtures or something like this if you want to be able to handle that in production, sending them to 0 by default. But now you've got all of these feature flags, you know how to get them, and you can. How are you actually going to set them in the first place? And this is, I think this is. I'm trying to think where I got this particular one. This might be for the Flickr interface, because it says feature flip. So Flickr use feature flags very, very extensively. They created a blog article a number of years ago called "Flipping Out," I think, part of the name where I got the name of the talk from. And they have a very complex infrastructure which includes UIs and stuff for this kind of type thing. So this is database driven. This just turns it on and off a general thing. But it also supports enabling feature flags for specific roles. So enabled for this host. enabled for admins, enabled for staff, enabled for users where the country ID equals, country code equals GB, enabled for whatever. And you can do that very finely grained stuff in the database. The other places in your config.yaml files, which are always ridiculously huge, especially when you've got a lot of feature flags in. Don't try and read this. Your eyes will just stop working. So config.yaml files, if you want to have a very strict way of enabling feature flags in production, staging, etc., this can be a reasonable way of doing it. For example, the Swift mailer, disabling delivery. You want to disable that in your test environments, but you don't want to ever have that disabled in production. That's a very simple thing there. Just use config.yaml files for that. There's no need you don't want to necessarily need that functionality to disable emails in production most of the time. But using them cleanly is hard. So we're talking about all of these feature flags, and I'm talking about having different profile pages, and you're showing these things, and you end up with these huge if statements. There are some really nice ways that you can just get this into different parts of your application. Twig. Who uses Twig? Who uses Smarty? Or Blade? Okay, a few of you. So different templating engines. Most templating engines, it's really easy to write a small little, normally it's probably only maybe 20 lines of code. Depends on the templating engine, I guess. To have custom functions that will just call through to PHP code. And you can use these in conditionals. So if you want to show a CFP form, then you can just have a very simple thing like this that can just route through. In Twig, this literally looks like this. There is nothing really much more to it. You then actually have a method called isEnabled, which will just pass it through into and call your PHP logic, which is hopefully just that simple interface we were talking about earlier. But being able to do this in templates is really useful. If you want to be able to disable a button, for example, you don't want to have to duplicate your template twice, and then just so that you can have a line in your PHP code saying if the feature flag is enabled, then do this template. If not, do this template. That's do not repeat yourself, right? Complexity. So I was mentioning these horrible if statements, and this is not ridiculous code. This kind of code exists in production tenfold. There are numerous, so if any of you use any tools like Scrutinizer or stuff like that run metrics on your code, then things like critical path analysis, cyclomatic complexity, they're all talking about the number of routes through one piece of code that you can go, so through different if statements. Now here, if we get to sort of here, then we're going through 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going through 4 different if statements. The cyclomatic complexity of this is just ridiculous. And that's basically a very small part of code that can be executed in so many different ways and produce so many different results. Now, code should be, one of the points of code is that we should be able to run it numerous times, and it should always produce the same result if we give it the same input, hopefully, with certain exceptions, like hashing or with different salts or whatever, depending on the input you put them in. But the thing is that realistically, you don't want your code looking like this. So there is, in this code here, there is one huge if statement. This is the first half, and this is the second half, which I've just truncated out. And essentially, what we're looking at here is is this new profile enabled? So we're having these two completely different profiles going on. Your new Facebook profile, which has balloons on it, and it displays weird things at the top, and it talks about stories or whatever else they've added. And then you've got this second part, which is the old legacy profile that everyone's used to and nobody's going to complain about. But realistically, you don't want to have huge if statements in your controller. If you have a controller and it has two independent, completely different pages it's rendering, that's kind of a bit of an ugly way of doing things. So, and this is something I picked up from Benjamin Eberle, is you can very simply define a completely different controller to execute on the same route. Who remembers back in the day when every file was a front controller and you had index_new.php, or index2, index3, index4.html, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to ask for hands because back then, right? And if you're still doing that now, then this. instead of having to have different routes, you can have the same route, but you can have it point to two completely different controllers. Now, the way that this works is we have our standard controller, and then we also define some extra little variables, essentially. We say what the alternate controller is, and we say what the flag is, that whether or not we should enable this alternate controller. And Symfony has a very nice event handling for this, as does Laravel, etc. And we can get these two attributes. We can get the flag, we can get the alternate controller, and if we can see if that feature flag is enabled, if it is, we just simply change what the actual controller is. We change what it's pointing to. And again, the logic of this is really important to consider in the fact that you only ever want to change to the alternate controller when that feature flag is true. By default, you should always be going for your original controller, your legacy. Failing safe, right? Okay, here, it gets a little bit more complex. So what we're actually talking about here is we're not providing an alternate controller. Sometimes you have a brand new feature that you only want to be accessible to certain people. Whether this is, or maybe it's a new admin panel or something like that. And what you can actually do is set a feature flag here. You can see if there is an alternate controller. And if there's not an alternate controller defined on that particular controller instance, then throw a 404. Because then essentially what you're doing is you're saying that there's a flag, and the flag is whether or not you should be able to access that page. The flag is on that entire page. So instead of having to wrap your entire controller in an if statement and then throwing a 404, you handle that logic completely independently in your routing. Factories. Who loves factories? Yay. I know it's after lunch, but okay, fine, whatever. Factories. So you can do the exact same thing with factories, right? Because sometimes you'll want to completely replace a service. You'll want to do something completely differently. You'll want to handle users differently. And you can do this in exactly the same way. Just create a simple profile factory in this particular instance. And this is for one feature flag. This is that we want to return a different factory depending on if a feature flag is enabled. Sometimes we'll return a new profile. Sometimes we'll return a legacy profile. But we can only use this for our one profile feature flag, right? Again, extract it out. So this is a flags factory. This will work for every single one of your feature flags, that is, so long as it's just a very simple, is the flag enabled, isn't the flag not enabled. We pass in the string, which is the flag name. We pass in the service, and we pass in the alternate controller. Again, we do exactly the same thing we were just talking about. And then in your services, you can define this flags factory as a class. You then have your profile manager. You say what you want the factory to be. You say what the arguments are. You say what you want it to be by default. You say what you want the flag to be. And you say what the alternate to be if you've enabled that feature flag. And therefore, you've got your generic flags factory. You never have to really think about it. The idea about feature flags is every single time you use one, it shouldn't be any work. It should be very, very simple to implement. And you shouldn't have to think about the underlying logic of how do feature flags work again. So, yeah. Now, one thing some people say about feature flags is they end up with a lot of them. Who uses feature flags and has quite a lot of them in their code base and has that kind of horrible conditional stuff going on? Or, yeah, a few of you. So I personally say that it's a really important thing to eventually remove them. Now, this is difficult to do. And honestly, I'm standing up here and I don't have a solution for that. I don't have a solution to say that every 6 months you should have a big cleanup of all your feature flags that are always enabled. Especially because when you go and enable all of your feature flags, you'll probably find out that actually one of them was disabled somewhere. So I'm going to say something potentially radical, because I'm up on stage and it'll be fine, but I'm dreading the QA. And I haven't said this in the previous iterations of the talk, but I'm going to say or not. I'm going to say you don't always need to remove your feature flags. Sometimes it's okay to just let them sit there. I imagine that Booking.com has a lot of feature flags. But when they go through to refactor that code, then realistically those feature flags are going to come out. But realistically, if your code works and you know the environment and you've got all of those feature flags set, then realistically you don't always need to take them out. Now, if you're developing something very small and you're developing a couple of things in tandem and then you bring that project together, then yes, remove your feature flags and try and keep your feature flags clean. Realistically, if it gets to the stage where you have all of these feature flags and they're all used in production, etc., and you're not working on that functionality, I wouldn't dedicate any time to going through and cleaning up your feature flags. Because realistically, that doesn't help you in terms of time-wise. Yes, you will end up with a higher cyclomatic complexity, but if you try and have it at a much higher level with things like controllers, that's not a problem. And if you know that that's always enabled, then get rid of the old controller and do that. So nobody's scowling at me too much after saying that, so I'll take it that wasn't so bad. So, feature flags. They allow you to do a bunch of things. Branching without conflicts or version control systems. Out of interest, actually, is there anyone who doesn't use version control still? I'm not going to judge you for it. I know that legacy systems and stuff. Okay. Essentially, if you don't have version control, and I understand that obviously that's something you always want to try and go towards, but realistically, sometimes you're consulting on a project and you find out that there isn't version control. You're literally just committing straight onto a server or editing with FTP or something like that. That happens. And realistically, if you want to suddenly implement something and you only want to test it, doing it like this is actually an okay way of doing that. However, try and get a VCS. If you're working with a VCS that doesn't support branching, I think there are a few like this, like the one that Google uses, which name temporarily escapes me. Then, again, it allows you to do that, and without those horrible Git conflicts. I come from, so I mentioned my background is PHP BB. One of the problems that we used to have with modifications and installations, so like customizations people could make to their forums, was when they went to upgrade PHP BB. Because these modifications would have actually edited the PHP code, realistically, they would end up with conflicts when they went to upgrade, and the updater would ask them how they wanted to solve these conflicts. And we all hate conflicts, right? And we can all develop PHP and HTML and stuff like that. Imagine trying to solve PHP conflicts and not being a PHP developer. That's what PHP users used to have to go through. We've fixed that, by the way. Things move on. But realistically, conflicts are awful, and you have to consider the fact that actually trying to solve conflicts is really difficult for junior developers, and sometimes actually it results in bugs coming out. GitHub recently implemented this new functionality where on their status checks, where it will only let you merge the pull requests or show the status checks as passing if the branch is up to date with the latest master, because solving conflicts can introduce bugs. And if you're doing that at the point which you're doing that merge, and you forget to run PHP unit or your test suite at that point, then you've lost. There was no point in having all of those status checks in there in the first place, right? And now there's a little button that says update conflicts, and you can do it within the GitHub UI, which is nice if you use the green button occasionally. Go GitHub. Testing in production. Testing in production is important. Realistically, when you roll out a new feature and you're testing it yourself, it's nice to be able to test it in production before everyone else is also testing it in production. Because realistically, if you roll something out and your users are hitting that bug, then that's either lost revenue or that's an extra 50 complaints coming into support. Support team costs in terms of the amount of work they have, that costs your company money. So realistically, you want to be, if you're able to test in production without actually having it affecting anyone negatively, that's a good thing, right? So this allows you to test in production. Slow rollout. This is what Facebook, I imagine, really like about this kind of thing. They can roll it out to one country, and then they can roll it out to another country. They can, You can roll it out to a subset of users, or you can do A/B testing. Functionality on different environments. You can also, as I said, have that different functionality in different environments. You don't need to have a different branch for your staging. Who has a very standard development process where they have one staging machine before going to production? Okay, so sometimes with just one staging machine, you can have these problems where, yes, it's touching production data, etc., but you've only got one staging, and if you're working on two different things which you want to deploy to production, potentially at different times, both of which you want to be testing and staging, then just having one staging environment can be a problem. But if you can dynamically just enable and disable these different pieces of functionality, it makes life so much easier, right? Because the code is the same in every single place where it's being executed. And finally, that A/B testing, testing conversion rates, testing how much money your company is making. And as I said, it's really important to try and do this cleanly. So database and configuration files, and avoiding those really large conditionals. Because ultimately, those really large conditionals are going to be what kills your application and makes it look really complex. Try and keep going up that logic tree. And ultimately, that's a way that you can use feature flags in a really clean way, in a way that will help make your company money and produce well-tested code that will get out to your users. Thank you very much. So I forgot to put a link in my slides, actually. However, a tweet will have gone out at the beginning of my talk with a link to my slides, and it's bit.ly/php-yorkshire-ff for feature flags. So you can look at the slides on there, or just have a look at my Twitter handle, Michael Cullum UK, not Michael Cullum Uck, which some people seem to pronounce it. If you've got any questions, Lorna has a wonderful microphone.
Why am not able to have correctly formatted code when I have multiple arguments in a method and I want to specify the return type?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a question for a different talk. I'm more than happy to come and chat about Fig stuff if you catch me out in the foyer afterwards. Yeah.
All right, feature toggles, questions? Oh, Sam.
Thanks very much, Lorna. You touched on the idea of test automation and how it's managed in feature flags, but is there any precedent for, I mean, have you ever worked on a system, for example, where you have two different sets of tests which run depending on whether a flag's turned on or off?
So something I have seen done is creating tests which explicitly set feature flags so that you can test an explicit matrix of changes. I've also seen it done where it will automatedly go through and test every single possible combinations of all the different matrices. However, so PHP unit allows you to have multiple different groups of tests. So for example, you can split your unit test from your functional test, which is actually a really good thing to do if you've got slow tests, for example, that run. With PHP, if we run our full slow test suite, then that takes about an hour or so. So obviously we don't have that running on Travis. So splitting your tests into multiple test groups and then having one which runs every single possible combination in your matrix of feature flags, even if you've got a few hundred feature flags, you know, that's not going to take a ridiculous amount of time. And you can set that off to Bamboo as a long-running task if you've got the worker capacity available. And then that actually gives you that immediate feedback as to whether or not two features that two developers are going to work on is going to have an error together. So yeah, have a look at PHP unit and grouping like that. That's the way of doing it. Cool. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering, how would you manage dependency between features? So like a feature that depends on another one that may or may not be enabled.
Yeah, that's a good shout. So in terms of if you've got multiple, realistically, you could introduce this that logic into actually into your configuration. I imagine it looked quite ugly. Generally, though, if you are nesting if statements, so if you've got one feature depending on another, then you can have them like that. That's a difficult one, actually. Not one I'd have to think about, but if we can have a chat about that out in the foyer afterwards, and I'll stick out a tweet later as to sort of outcome of that discussion, because I think that's a bit of a longer topic. But yeah, that's a very real problem. But generally, if you've got one feature depending on another, then you can just simply have multiple feature flags, like within one line of code. You know, if this and that, then yeah. Noxie? Or actually, sorry, Kat, because you're slightly closer to Lorna, I think.
What's your thought on like bitwise feature flags?
Bitwise feature flags?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's have a chat about that afterwards, actually, as well.
I think he just said, I don't care.
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to expand on. You can have extend the interface and have a depends on, and then you have in the implementation it checks for both. So it says, oh, if it's a depends on, it also has to have that flag set, and if it doesn't have a depends on, it just skips it. That's very easy to add.
Yeah. Cool. Is that a hand up? Oh, okay.
Somebody just fidgeted. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, let's wrap that up. Thank you so much. This was informative.